Thank you, Kristen, for coming.
Absolutely.
Want to give background?
Sure.
Yes.
So,
Jump into it.
Yes, thank you, Kristen, for coming. Yeah, I owe her big time.
so I'm Kristen. Let's just keep it casual. So if you guys have questions as we're going along, let's just have a conversation. So my background is actually in educational psychology. I have lots of training in that, so that means lots of work in assessment and how we know what people know, how we understand how people learn, those kind of things. I've been with Pearson about 2 years, and before that I actually worked with Cisco for a while, the computer networking company. Before that I was a school psychologist in Glendale Elementary. With Cisco got started thinking about simulations because we were designing this curriculum for teaching computer networking skills to high schoolers and community college students, and it turns out that practicing on $10,000 computing equipment doesn't work so well when we break it and find out. So we started building simulators, and then we started thinking about putting a game layer on top of the simulation, and then started thinking about, well, we have all these students entering doing all this simulation programming. How can we use that data to understand what they know and what they can do? And so I started thinking about this idea of gathering data from students as they're doing learning activities. And this it developed into this idea of what we call invisible assessment. So we were just talking kind of beforehand about all of these high-stakes assessments that students are taking, and lots of tests that they're taking where we say, stop what you're doing, we're stopping the learning activity, okay, now take a test. And the idea is, instead of doing that, we can think about gathering data from students as they're interacting in these digital environments and use that data to understand what they know and can do. So that's the vision, and so that's where I am at this point and what we'll talk about today. So I work in the Research and Innovation Network at Pearson. So that means I'm kind of on the R&D side. So what you're going to hear today is not the, this is what Pearson's products are announcing tomorrow. It's much more, this is what we're exploring and thinking about. The second piece of this is a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is part of a collaboration that we're part of called GLASS Lab, Games Learning and Assessment Lab. And it's a collaboration between the research center that I'm a part of, EA, the Institute of Play, which is the nonprofit that runs the school in Chicago and one in New York that are very game-based, and they do a lot of kind of games and education work, and ETS. And basically, about 2 years ago, we got, the Institute of Play got some funding from Gates and MacArthur to think about designing game-based assessments and building scenarios. And so EA donated the code to SimCity to the project. And so that's where the what does it mean if I bulldoze half the city comes in. So as we'll talk about, we have designed some scenarios in SimCity and are trying to use evidence from it, but turns out, as you all know, when you give kids games, they do all sorts of unexpected things in them. So we want them to do something, and they're all bulldozing half the city. So how do we collect evidence, and what does that mean is the big question. So we talk a lot about the current assessment environment, and where we're from is kind of the digital desert. So a lot of the way we do assessment right now is based on the technology constraints of the past, of the 50s and 60s, and we didn't have any view into what students were doing as they were learning. So we had to say, we're going to drop in and give you these kind of constricted tests, and we don't really have a lot of technology to score them, so we have to have you fill in these bubbles because that's what we can automatically score for thousands of students. And so we have this kind of situation where we say we're parched for data, to extend the metaphor a little bit, and that's what a lot of our tests look like and where they come from. And what we want to do is move into
Sorry. Hold on. Right.
there, we'll just go with the arrows. The digital ocean! That built up a little suspense. Where we have data about what kids are doing. And so we can, and using that data to understand those things. So how do we build invisible assessments? And so this is what mostly I'm going to talk about here for the rest of the time, is this idea of how we build these things. And we start with something that we call evidence-centered assessment design. And this is just kind of a theoretical way of thinking about things that we found to be really flexible and helps us frame the things we want to know. So it starts off with, well, what is it that we want to know about students? What are the knowledge, the skills, other attributes that we're interested in knowing about? And so that becomes our student model. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. And then from there we say, okay, well, what things could we see people do that would tell us about those things, that would give us information about that? And then what tasks or activities could we design that would elicit those behaviors from players that are doing it? So we have on the left the student model, what we want to know about. We have on the right, we call the task model, different ways that we can design activities. And then linking those two is this evidence model, where we say, how do we take the things that players are doing in the game, what often looks like a log file of evidence, extract things from that are meaningful, and then combine those statistically to tell us about that student model. So this is kind of the way we think about how we build what those are. And so to kind of walk through this, I'll give you a couple examples. So on the left, I'll talk about SimCityEDU, which is this game that's based on SimCity. On the right is a game we literally released a preview version of today, like 2 hours ago. And it is Mars Generation 1, and this one is a made from scratch game, so we, instead of starting from SimCity, like with SimCity, we started from an already made game. This one we started from scratch, and it's based on argumentation skills, and I'll show you a little bit more about it. But the idea is that you are colonizing Mars, and there's a whole lot of decisions to be made, and as you can imagine, there's some arguments that start to happen. And we start to then talk about, well, what makes a good argument? How do you defend your argument against someone else? And they build these robots that actually are the arguments, where they're matching claims and evidence to build arguments to defend their opinions about and their ideas about what should happen on the colony. And so that's actually an iPad-based game, and so it's the first version that's out today, and there's going to be lots more added as we go, so we'll see. But before we begin with either of those, we start out with that idea of a student model. What is it that we're interested in knowing? And so this is really kind of your theory of how students build skills. And so for SimCity, we looked and did a lot of brainstorming because we already had this game. So we had to say, well, what are the kinds of skills and things that we might be interested in? And so after lots of discussion, we came up with this systems modeling idea that's part of next generation science standards. And this idea that when you have a system, all of the parts of the system are interrelated. Changing one part of the system affects a lot of the other parts of the system. And understanding that, whether it's in a city or an ecological system or any of those kinds of places, is important for being able to think about what the impact of actions is. And so in this idea of systems thinking, we have something called a learning progression. And this idea of a learning progression is basically outlining how someone moves from a novice state to intermediate to an expert in a given area. And it outlines the kinds of things that they know and would be able to do at each of those stages. And it's actually often more involved in this, but what you have here is kind of a simple overview of the one we used for the systems thinking. And it starts off at the bottom where the player's just kind of doing things, not really thinking about causes and effects and what the outcomes of actions are going to be. The second level is this univariate relationship idea. So the player focuses on a single causal relationship, so one cause to one effect, and thinks about their actions in relation like that. They move into this idea of multiple effects from a single cause, so being able to see those relationships, and then as they become more advanced, thinking about multiple causes and multiple effects, and finally seeing the whole system and patterns that arise from it over time. So,
are there probably different environments in games that facilitate the development in those specific areas?
Right.
What's an example of an emergent pattern game, like a growing amoeba thing?
So we're actually thinking we want to design a game that will tell us where a player is on all of these things. So, but as you'll see, we were pretty successful at 1 through 3B, and being able to differentiate between whether someone's at 3B or 4, we were less successful at. But the idea of what we're trying to do now is to be able to take the game actions and design tasks that would tell us, are you at 2 or are you at 3A? So this is the foreshadowing, the next things we're going to talk about, is how do you design a task that tells you where someone likely is, that would differentiate someone who's at 2 from someone who's at 3A or 3B to 4. And so that's what we actually wanted to do in our task design, was to do that kind of differentiation of where people are. And at the same time, figure out where they are and then lead them up to getting to the next levels, so that they're also progressing in learning and we're able to understand where they are by the end of the day. So that's the systems thinking piece, and we'll get into some of what those tasks are that we designed in just a minute. The Argubot Academy, there actually are English language arts standards around argumentation that the Common Core has laid out. And so there are, here we have a 4-level progression that goes from preliminary to foundational to basic to intermediate. So again, we don't get all the way to experts in this section of the game that we've created. We've got the 4 pieces here. And in here you see we go from things like identifying reasons people give to support a specific point, to supporting reasons or evidence in an argument and relating them, to, at the bottom, identifying specific points that are vulnerable to objection or counter-arguments. So you can start to see the formation of this idea of being able to counter or object to someone else's argument and rebutting someone's piece. Over on the basic for expression, you have builds, logical, hierarchically structured arguments. So you get to the idea of both building arguments yourself and rebutting them from other people. So these ideas of the progressions, though, really end up being part of what we're also going to be reporting on at the end. So we're going to be saying, okay, you've done all of this play. We think you're kind of at this, likely at this basic level of interpretation and maybe a foundational level of expression. And what does that mean for people? And the whole game design is based on the idea of being able to tell what's happening at each of these levels. So this coming in or developing a theory of how people progress through a given content area is a really important piece to then being able to assess. We have to be clear what it is that we're interested in. So from there, then we start thinking about what are these tasks and what are these pieces. So here, wow, that's really dark on that screen.
Just maybe switch it off for a second so I can see. There we go.
That's a little lighter. So this is the city in SimCity. So what we did with SimCity was we had 4 scenarios that each build on each other. I'll describe mostly the 4th one, which is called Jackson City. And you come in and the mayor says, oh, thank goodness you're here. All the Sims are getting sick. They're leaving the city. Can you figure out what's going on and help us fix it? And it seems like the air is kind of dirty. We're not sure what's going on. So the players go through and can explore, find out that there's a lot of air pollution in the city. And what you see over on the right are thermometers. One's for pollution and one's for jobs. And so essentially what we end up asking them to do in this highest one is being able to reduce air pollution and increase jobs in the city. So you can see that's multiple effects that we're talking about. So what happens is they find out that there's a couple things that cause pollution in the city, coal plants and industrial buildings and industrial zoning. So to get rid of pollution, you could just bulldoze coal plants. But of course, if you bulldoze your coal plants, your city's underpowered, and pretty soon your city shuts down because there's no power in the city. So in fact, you need to place coal plants before, or place alternative energy plants before you bulldoze coal plants so that you can replace that power. So you see that idea of coal plants, a single cause, has multiple effects. So it affects power and it affects pollution. So if someone is at that univariate level of thinking, they may just be thinking one of those. Coal plants affect pollution. just bulldoze the coal plants. So if we see evidence where someone is just bulldozing coal plants, not doing the replacement with other kinds of energy, we're thinking they're probably in that univariate level. Whereas if they are putting down the replacement energy, then bulldozing, that sequence tells us they're probably thinking more at a multivariate level and understanding a single cause has multiple effects.
What kind of timeframes have you seen from univariate to multivariate, and what type of facilitative environmental factors help make that transition?
So we can in-game see students kind of moving from there over. Generally, what happens is it takes them 2 to 3 attempts at the scenario. So the first attempt, they bulldoze them, city fails, okay, try again. They try some more things. Usually in 2 or 3 attempts, they're starting to get it in the game. The question that we can talk about a little more at the end is how much does what happens in the game translate outside the game? That's an important piece. So there's a couple things, though, in terms of facilitative factors that we have put in. So we put in when a student when the player fails. You know, you run out of power in the city. You might want to think about what kinds of things provide power in the city. So we provide some scaffolding with some of the sims and the characters and the mayor coming in and giving them some help and hints if they seem to be running out of power and not pulling in those things. And we've played around quite a bit with what those hints should be.
That happens automatically in the game, doesn't it? You
Right.
get the little electricity
Yes.
symbol.
Yeah. And so that's kind of the nice thing is we try to build it in, and in many places there are already existing things in the game that
So
are giving
there's
them those
an immediacy of consequences for
Right.
alterations.
for what they're doing. Yeah. So this is the idea, though, of building a task that helps us differentiate between those levels where students are and using then their actions as evidence for what we think where we think they are. So that is the task model of SimCity. We'll look a little bit more at the evidence in a minute. And then in terms of the Mars Generation 1, there are 2 components to it. One is building your argument, which is basically building your robot, where you have to match your claims and your evidence. And that's what's going on in the upper left there, is you have a claim and you have to go around and collect and find the evidence that supports your claim, that's relevant, and that is supportive, not relevant and not supportive, and build your argument up. And then at the bottom, you have your battles. And basically, you can go and argue against other people. And so this can be everything from what kind of protein should we have? Should we have fish or should we have soy? What kind of ice cream is there? Should we have pets on Mars? All these kind of different arguments that they can start to build up. And then the person you're arguing against, depending on how their argument is structured, they can go in and see how the other person's robot is structured, can design how they want to argue against that. So they can argue from expertise. So there might be evidence that says you're arguing against with expert opinion. You can argue from observation. So you can collect your own data to build your argument. So it's all of these kinds of argument that are laid out in the kind of argumentation world of how you link claims and evidence. And so again, we're looking at, for evidence, how they're linking their claims and their evidence, and then how they're choosing to argue with the other robots about what the colony should look like. And all of that is providing us kind of that information. So the interesting thing that we want to try to do, of course, is matching all of these game mechanics and learning mechanics. And Sam Messick is actually an assessment guy. He talks about validity and did a lot of writing on validity. And in the assessment world said the nature of the construct being assessed should guide the selection of the relevant task. And the same thing holds true, it turns out, when we're looking at games. And our game designers have talked about this idea of the game is built around this core mechanic, and the mechanic creates this core loop, and that we want that loop to match the competency. So if we think about what the argumentation is, it's evaluating evidence, constructing an argument, and critiquing an argument. That's the skills that we're looking at. And so in the game, the mechanic is finding evidence, equipping your robot, and battling robots. So that kind of core of the loop matches the core that we're interested in the competency of. And that's kind of I think, one of the keys of trying to build in the learning and assessment into the game pieces here. At Eline, I'm sure you've had Jim G talking about the chocolate and broccoli and all of that. We don't want to make this being chocolate on top of the broccoli. That doesn't help the broccoli be any better. So we want to make a nice cohesive piece that fits together. And that's as we think about what the task design is. And I think this is a big piece of this that I see is on the education side. So we have lots of folks that are at our company that would say, we can build a game. They've got a lot of education knowledge. They've got a lot of assessment knowledge. Not so much game knowledge. And you guys would look at the game and be like, that's a horrible game. But I think it's the same thing from the game side, is for a game designer to say, I can build this educational game. Great, you've got tons of game knowledge, but you really need some education expertise and some assessment expertise. And I think this piece really argues for bringing people together. And it's very difficult to imagine one person who can pull in all of these things together. So my work with actual game designers has led me to understand you guys have a lot of skill in science and art in what you do, and that in the same way that I know a lot about assessment and shouldn't try to do your job, we should all come together and do this as a piece, I think, than one of us trying to do it all. It's one of my big lessons in all of this work. So we have our tasks that hopefully we've all come together, and we have these discussions like the assessment group says, we need this to happen now so we can get the evidence we need. And we have the game designer saying, we need this to happen now because we need to maintain this engagement over here. And we have the learning people saying, but we need to provide the scaffold here so they don't get frustrated. And so it's these big discussions and push and pull about what this is really going to look like. We all agree at a high level, but when it gets down to really what happens in the game, there's a lot of push and pull and discussion that happens around what's going on there. So we have our student model. We knew these learning progressions tell us how we're moving. We have our tasks design, and now the key is this linking of them from one to the other. And this piece of what is the evidence in the game that we're going to use? What are we going to pull out that means something? So I'm going to show you a snapshot of a spreadsheet. Really exciting. We literally made a spreadsheet for Mars Generation 1 that is, the standards, what are the skills? Identifying one piece of data that relates to a specific argument is one of the skills. It matches to that Common Core state standard. Okay, so what is the variable? It's data relations. What are the game phases? Keeping, sorting, discarding, and what is the evidence? So they construct this dual core claim. So they have two cores in their robots. So there's two claims. And what are they doing? So it literally outlines what's going on and what evidence we have within the game where they're switching their cores on and off in their robots for depending on what argument they want to make. So each of these pieces of evidence links up to specific skills, and then they all relate to these variables that we can't actually observe, like understanding how data relates to each other, or the role that data plays in the argument. And those are the things that we're trying to estimate. So this is kind of the unfun part, but really important of thinking about how do we link what we see in the game to the skills that we're interested in.
So is your gap like with the SimCity coal thingies? Is your gap in the knowledge not knowing if they contemplated the consequences, but being unable to figure that out?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have what we can observe, and trying to link what we observe to what they really know in their brains. We can't crack open their brains and say that. So we need to collect a lot of pieces of evidence, and hopefully by bringing all of those pieces together, we get a good sense of it. But you'll see we also do all of this using probability. So we're never saying, we're absolutely sure we know this. We're going to say, we're like 85% sure this is what level you're at. Because, yeah, it's really hard to know what people really know and not know. And given different contexts, they'll show you different things.
Yeah, so maybe they're good finicky with Photoshop or something, and they tricked the SimCity.
They'll pick it. Exactly. So in SimCity, some of our evidence pieces were this idea of placing green energy before you bulldoze the coal plant. We had whether they bulldoze the industrial buildings and de-zone that area. Another indication they understand how to get rid of pollution. So that's kind of two different ways of getting rid of pollution. So two causes for a single effect. Rezoning areas as commercial builds up jobs. So that's another piece of evidence. Building new roads and then zoning them commercial. So again, another way of creating new jobs and new spaces. De-zoning residential areas and then zoning them commercial. Again, so you're taking out some of those people, but then adding in more spaces for jobs. And then we have some end state things. So we think about what you do in the sequence, and then you have what's your end state. Where did you end up in terms of how much pollution you had or how many jobs you had in the city? So this evidence, if we think of this as evidence, this looks a lot different than did you get the right answer or not, right? If you are familiar with assessment, a lot of assessment data is a bunch of zeros and ones, correct and incorrect. And that's pretty easy to combine. We can just add those up and you get a score. How do we take this kind of information and translate that into something meaningful about someone's systems thinking? So this is a little bit where some of the statistics and my expertise comes in. So I'm going to kind of walk you through a little bit of the simplified version of how this looks. But we have this overall idea of systems thinking, and then we have all these different pieces that relate to it. So remove and replace is one of them. It's the idea of did you remove the coal plant and replace it with green energy? Now, so that's the variable we want to know about and one piece of evidence, and we have, like I said, lots of those pieces as we just saw. But what we do is we say, all right, we have this learning progression, right, from level 1 to level 4. If I know nothing about you, so I have no idea where you are, I'm going to just give us a 20% chance you're at any of these levels because I don't know anything about you. So I have no way of judging that. So that's where we're going to start from. And what we're going to always be doing is playing with that percentage. How likely are you to be at each of these levels based on the evidence as we get more and more understanding about what you know? So this remove, replace isn't actually just yes or no, did you or didn't you? We actually have 6 different variations of that. One is that you didn't remove or replace. State 2 is, well, you either removed or you placed green energy, but you didn't do both. And we move on through these to the last one where you've got them in correct sequence, you replaced it before you removed it. And so you're thinking about this idea of there's pieces of that, and you perform zoning commercial areas and removing some industry. So we've got 6 different states of that. And basically what we do...
How many of these states did you determine and quantify these? And how many did you generate based on observed patterns?
Good question. So we started out with a hypothesis that had 4 of these. And then we did some play testing and saw some players doing some other things in the middle here where we've got industry not removed and green, the commercial zones not placed. So some of these different combinations of that. So where do those fit in? And what are players who are doing that? Where do they fit into systems thinking? And so added those through. So there's definitely a lot of iterations to this. And as we get into the next steps, we actually need some decent-sized numbers of students playing to get the kind of evidence we need. Because where we're headed is something that looks like this, which is a probability table. And this says if you are at level 1 of systems thinking, so you're kind of at that A-causal level, what's the probability that you're going to be at that state 1 where you don't remove or replace or do any of that? 75%, let's say. What's the probability that you are at that next level, which state 2, remember, was the one manipulated, so removed coal or placed green energy or removed industry. 15%. So we go through and basically do that for each level. So at the highest levels, so if you're at level 3B of systems thinking, you've got that multivariate. There's maybe a 40% chance that you're at level 5, and there's still not a really high chance that you're at level 6. So where do these numbers come from? They started out literally being guesses. We like to call it expert judgment, but there was a lot of guessing. And then we have players play, and we get an independent measure where we think their systems thinking is, and we look at people that are pretty much at level 1 of systems thinking and see what they're doing in the game, and how likely are they to be doing each of these different states that we're looking at, and match those up and end up creating these. And so we start off doing this with like maybe 50 students, but in the end, our beta testing has been about 500. So to get these numbers solid in a way that you can feel confident in them, you need some pretty good numbers, because what you want to get is have at least one person in all of these cells, or at least enough that you think it's likely that you're getting them to figure out where people are. So you're trying to not just test 500 kids that are level 1, you want 500 that are kind of across all of these levels, so you can get a good sense of what they do when they play the game. So that's definitely a challenge piece in doing some of these, as we get a little more sophisticated in these methods of bringing the evidence together. So what does this get for us? This is kind of the fun part. So now, remember, I know nothing about you. Now I can observe what you do in the game. So let's say you play the game, and I observe that you bulldozed the coal plant, but you didn't replace it, and you didn't do any of the industry removal. Now, because I've got those probabilities behind me, I can make some estimates, and this will update. What it basically is doing is using something called Bayesian probabilities. It's called a Bayesian network. And it's updating the probability that you're at level 2 or level 3, and it says, well, since we observed that you're at level 2, there's probably you're at state 2, there's probably a 40% chance that you're at level 2 here. Now, if we have another student play, and we observe that they're we observe that they're at level 5, or they're at state 5, so they did the perhaps remove and replace, but didn't get into the zoning and dezoning. Well, we think then they're either at 3B or 4, and this gets back to that question of how can we distinguish between these two, and we found that in fact it was pretty difficult to in this game figure out whether people were at 3B or 4. We didn't have a lot of activities that were very good at that. So we found that people who were at those two levels on kind of an independent measure of systems thinking played the game pretty similarly. So basically we're pretty good at discriminating between people who are level 1 and 2, 2 and 3A, 3A and 3B, but after that they're doing a lot of similar things in the game. So we could go back and say, let's think up some harder tasks that get at this discrimination. Or we can say, you know what, we're pretty happy with the 4 levels that we're able to get at here, and go from there and stick to that.
And they may be interdependent.
And right, they may be related to each other and difficult to really tease apart anyway. Because the other piece is that the learning progressions themselves, in most cases, are theories. And so some of the work we're doing feeds back into saying, well, is this really how people learn? Are there really 2 separate levels here? Or most people kind of go back and forth depending on what context they're in? So we're also, in some cases, updating our learning theories as we're thinking about the evidence from the game. But so you can imagine now this is just one piece of evidence, the remove and replace, and we gather more and more evidence. We update those probabilities up at the top, and we become more and more confident about where we think someone is in the progression. So that's kind of the power of the Bayes nets. The other power that they have is once you know this evidence, it not only updates the evidence at the top piece, it also updates the probability that you'll be successful on these other nodes. So if you're building an adaptive game and you want it to know, for instance, and you want to give the next task to be something that someone maybe has a 50% chance of being successful at, you can actually use the updated probabilities from this network to feed into your game and to tell it what to choose next to do. So that's another kind of nice piece and way that Bayes nets can be used to build that activity. So these evidence models, that was a basic one. They get really big fast. So if you have lots of skills or sub-skills that you're interested in, this is actually from one of the Cisco games where we had a top skill about understanding IP addressing and lots of sub-skills related to that and prerequisite skills and lots of different pieces of evidence. And it turns out the statistics run on this get pretty difficult and the computer actually starts bogging down. And so if you want to do any real-time reporting, it gets tough. And we started actually building, breaking these into pieces so that we have some smaller nets that we estimate as we get pieces and then bring them together to tell us about the overall skills. So we might take, these 3 skills over here that are related to each other and estimate them separately, and then just take the overall piece and hook that into the main skill, just to ease up the computing that it takes to do some of this effort. And there's software that runs these Bayesian networks that are pretty nice and not too difficult to kind of plug in, open source kind of things that you can use to do that. So with that, I will just give you some final thoughts and then we can chat. A couple things. So one is thinking about how to communicate this back to students and teachers. So we do all this effort, all this design to figure out where students are, where they are in these progressions. How do we communicate that to students and teachers in a way that means something to them, that they know what to do with that information? So if I tell you you're at level 3A, what should you do next? What does that mean? So understanding this idea of learning progressions, communicating it, and then creating communication tools that feed back to the students is another important way to close the loop on what's going on here. And in some ways you can think about that as ways that are in the game, and we already have, in the game lots of ways to communicate how someone's doing. And you can build on those as communication tools, but teachers also want things where they can aggregate up all their students and see how all their students are doing and drill down to be able to tell, then, okay, which students are doing poorly and well and communicate. So those are important. Second, lots of feedback along the way. So I talked a little bit about this, lots of cycles, and you guys are probably better at this than we are as big companies. In a big company, sometimes it's hard to be agile, but it's really important to be changing. And when I think about what, for instance, the Mars game started out as, it looked very different when we first started designing it to what it is today, because you can't get tied to one particular thing because you put it in front of kids and it doesn't work and you need to change it. So lots of that, and I've learned I really don't think like a middle schooler. So it's good to talk to middle schoolers if you're making a game for middle schoolers. And then third, this idea of working together in game and learning and assessment designers coming together, and those are separate and important skills, and that triangle and push-pull of all of them I think is what really leads to good games and that we can build on and do. So I'll stop there. A couple other things. Some co-authors and I have written a couple things, like 3 things game designers need to know about assessment. And that is actually in a book, but if you contact me, I can probably get you the chapter. And the second is a white paper that is freely available on the Institute of Play website. It's like 100 pages long, so it gets really in-depth into some of this stuff I was talking about, but if you're interested, take a look. And yeah, that's me. I'm glad to get in touch and talk. And the research network site I blog at fairly regularly and talk about some of this stuff that's in process. So questions, thoughts, comments?
To what extent did you say that they take the insights gained from playing and use them in other aspects of the life?
We're still early days, I would say. I don't have lots of evidence that they're definitely doing that. It's interesting. I'll tell you that an anecdote though about that is one of this thing about argumentation is understanding how evidence should support an argument. And so we were doing some play testing with this middle school girl had decided that she wanted to have this argument that she was going to have the soy protein. And she's going around and looking for evidence for it in the environment. So they do some environmental exploration to find the evidence for their arguments. And she's just kind of playing and going along, and she goes back in and changes her argument to fish, from soy to fish. And so the person who was, kind of doing the think alouds with her said, "Oh, why did you do that?" She said, "Well, I thought I wanted soy, but I saw that most of the evidence really supported fish, so I thought that fish is probably the better choice." We were like, if we could just get people to argue with evidence like that, we've succeeded. Our whole political system would change. So that's what we'd like to see. How much that will actually happen and how much what happens in the game generalizes is still an open question. We are doing some work around correlating what happens in the game to other assessments and other ways we can measure things like systems thinking. But yeah, that evidence is still being built, I think.
When you're doing like Mars Generation 1 and you did playtesting, for example, do you differentiate between playtesting for fun of the game, or playtesting for educational value of the game, or assessment? I mean, how does that work?
We're usually looking for those all three. The one thing that does get pulled aside is just usability issues, because that'll kill your playtest. They can't actually do it. They can't play the game. So first you've got to work out enough of the usability issues that they can work on it. But we generally have, so when we do playtesting, we do usually a video capture, and we have someone working with them doing kind of the think alouds and questioning. We vary sometimes whether we just let them play and question after, or whether we question them during. Rusty can tell you more about cognitive lab kind of techniques. But then what happens is we have everyone is analyzing that playtest. So the assessment designers and the game designers and the game designers and the learning designers are all sitting together talking about, right? Then we all talk about what did you see, what did you see, what did you see. So, yeah. Sure.
This is kind of a question for you and a general question for everyone. To what extent do you think learning requires or is facilitated by an experimental environment? So you try something and see the results almost.
Yeah, and one of the big arguments for games is that it lets people fail in a way that isn't so risky. As I was saying, you don't break the $10,000 piece of equipment. And in that situation, I think it was, hugely important for learning, because that idea of seeing the results of your work and being able to try and succeed seems big. There's lots of, competing theories of how people learn, and I don't know, from my research background, if we can say that is definitely better than this other one, but it seems, for instance, better than sitting and having someone talk at you, like I've been doing for the last half hour.
You could have played a game on this.
Right.
Maybe this is a game.
That's
Different sticks, women's hands.
Am I a player or a researcher? I'm not sure. So what is learning? That general question.
That's a good question too. We could talk about that for at least a semester. The interesting thing is, I think, I'll tell you my thoughts on that, which is there's definitely, I see learning as an internal change in how you understand and think, but we can't see that. So what we can observe is a change in how you behave. And so how do we link what we see to what is happening internally is the question for me in assessment.
Call it the reduction in the threshold for neurological reconfiguration. But I think you can measure it. I don't know how advanced, EEGs or
Right.
So you can measure the physical change and then discover the patterns or environmental factors that influence that, the desired patterns, I guess, theoretically.
Yeah, the whole question. There's a lot of cool work going on where people are doing fMRIs and EEGs and all of that work. And in a classroom, of course, that's in no way scalable. We're not going to be hooking everybody up. So can we make connections between things we could see in a game and what's happening in the fMRIs? Then we could use the game as the stand-in for giving everyone the fMRIs.
That's a reasonable assumption.
Besides, looking in your head is cheating. So.
Right. It's like the cheat code, right?
Yeah.
Did you guys study the role of the teacher in while showing the games to the kids so that they don't compete who bulldozes faster the whole thing?
Yes. So it's been interesting, and we did do trials in classrooms where we had teachers and looking to see what teachers do. I will say that usually when we do this, the teachers that try it out are kind of the evangelist teachers. They're teachers that already love games and are kind of predisposed to do this. And I think there still remains a big question about how to get teachers, the average teacher, to use games in the classroom. And that's a huge issue at this point. But the teachers that are really into games and like it absolutely do a variety of things. So they can be the ones who, when someone changes their argument, is there to say, tell me why you changed your argument. What's going on there? And what's happening? The piece about monitoring 25 kids all playing at the same time is interesting too. So we've been playing around with the idea of some apps that a teacher could have that would, red flag student things. So if the student's bulldozing half the city, they get a red flag that says, go see Johnny, who's bulldozing half the city, and see what's going on. So we're playing around with ways we can help teachers better manage gameplay in a classroom. Because that's certainly a concern we hear from lots of teachers. Is they're not necessarily comfortable themselves with the game, and thinking about then how to involve their students is a little scary for.
It's an important question because I've worked on other products where we've built in an element of fun into the learning experience, and the kids, because it's so unusual, for example, things like being able to chat with my neighbor, or I can build an avatar and make it, get things to change my avatar. The kids will, because it's so unique, they'll really glom onto that, and the teachers freak out because they're not learning right then, and so it's a tricky thing to get them to balance that.
They're actually learning more, and the teacher's not aware.
Well, the engagement and the novelty wears off after a while too. There's that whole idea that I'm going to attach to that in the beginning and then move on.
I used to teach math elementary and high school. Friday was game day, math game day. And to justify it, there are several studies that show that chess will increase, boy, that can be right. Will increase quantifiably your test scores, your standardized test scores in math, if you do that. And there's also a game that was made locally here, SET, made by geneticists, where it's a pattern recognition, which has also been shown in research to measurably increase math scores.
Well, music in classrooms, there's all kinds of things. So,
That actually raises also a point for me. What about games outside of the classroom? Things like Dragon Box are really awesome and unique, and does it need to have teacher influence or not, or maybe parents, or what's the role of games outside the classroom for learning?
Yeah, I think it's actually easier to get some adoption outside of the classroom because you don't have this whole set. So I know a lot of folks who are kind of in the game design space who've basically given up on trying to get in the classroom and said, we're just going to go for after school and informal learning environments and home play. And so I think that's absolutely legitimate and can be happening. And I'd like to see this idea of the whole DigitalOcean is that we kind of start to fall away those distinctions between here and now, and all our data can live together. But England just closed its doors yesterday, so maybe not. But I think so. My kind of motivation really for even going and coming to Pearson was the challenge of trying to get them into the classroom. So I'm big on thinking how can we integrate these into the rest of the curriculum in a way that's easier to use. So that's just something that I see as a challenge that I want to tackle. But absolutely, I think there's places for games all over.
I mean, I think it's a great challenge. Obviously, I agree with you where you're trying to go. But at the same time, I mean, to really have innovation and to really get unique ideas and mindsets put into this space, I think you kind of need a lot more than just the ones thinking about the classroom. But the biggest part, the trouble, or aside from making the game and actually having assessment and learning and good fun gameplay, is how do you fund something like this, or how do you get to meet a scientist such as yourself and incorporate the right themes? So as an independent, it's kind of difficult. There's a high bar to actually get to across. Maybe there's some tricks or tools, or you mentioned something briefly about how you can incorporate some shareware or some kind of free tools that you can build into your games. But like Alex, he's doing something on his own, and so maybe how can we help him really make something that has some great assessment and some great learning in it without necessarily having a big budget or a giant team or scientists behind him.
Yeah, it almost seems like reaching out to the indie crowd was her trick for trying
exactly.
to get
My trick is coming to you guys.
Because it's a smart move. Yeah, that's a great idea.
I think that there's a couple of things that do make it hard, and the cost. That's what Pearson. Every time we bring up games, they say it's too expensive too.
And I've lowered the cost of those suckers too a lot.
So, but I think there's people. What I see in my experience has been that interest in this is increasing. I have reporters calling and people who want to know about this, and I think as interest rises, we'll see. I know 4 or 5 awesome people coming out of educational psychology and assessment programs this year that are focused on ideas of games and simulations and assessments and thinking about those ideas. And that doesn't seem like a lot, 4 or 5 people, but if there's 10 people here and 4 or 5 people here, and we can start to, I think, build those communities and what they're doing. So I think it's all about relationships, and that's why I'm here, because I think it's just getting out there and talking to other people. So I really think the days of being able to sit in your room and program it up are rough. You got to get out and be talking to people and building the community.
Has anyone done a Kickstarter for a game?
Mm-hmm.
I've seen a ton on there that get overfunded. Has anybody seen that turtle programming game?
Yeah,
Man, he made a ton. Then he went to Amazon, shut him down. He sold so many they thought it was some weird quirky. And I've seen a ton. Board Game Geek, you see Kickstarters on those all the time. But that wouldn't get in the classroom. But for funding, it seems to be pretty popular.
Yeah. Well, I know also there's SBIRs right now. Right.
What's SBIR?
So the federal grants. The different departments, the small business.
What's the time for that?
Right now, it's open.
If you apply for a grant and actually getting it approved or disproved, is that like 2 years, or 3 months?
It could be a couple months.
Wow, okay, so that's pretty fast.
It's not so bad.
Yeah,
But
I've
you're going to look
actually
for
worked
partners.
with a couple. I was going to say I've worked with a couple small business folks that were applying to SBIRs.
Yeah, I'd like to put
advising.
at least 1 or 2 together this time around. I think the deadline is June.
What are the ranges for grants? How much?
So it's usually about $150,000 for 6 months to do the phase 1, which is research, And
2
then
months and 150.
no,
That's
6 months.
right. I know, but 2 months
150,000.
to hear a yay or nay, and then you get pretty good funding. Wow.
Yeah. And then so second phase is about I think up to 750,000 for 2 years where you get to develop. And then after that though, and that's the thing about the SBIR is that you have to show that it's going to be sustainable after that. So you have to actually have a business case behind it as well.
Right.
And so I think you're supposed to say around the total of $1 million for all 3 rounds of funding.
Sounds good. How competitive is it?
It's competitive, but I think it's still doable.
That sounds very progressive.
I mean, I submitted a couple of years ago. I didn't quite make it, but they told me if I would have resubmitted it, it was probably a good chance. My priorities shifted. But like groups like Filament and Muzzy Lane, I mean, they get them, but also it's almost only them. So I think there's room for competition in this as well. But again, is that enough money? Is that enough or not? For the really good games, or I mean, SimCity. I mean, that wasn't 150.
So I'll
that
tell
was,
you, so Gates gave for 3 years $3 million, and that's supposed to be funding 4 games, 2 mods, and 2 built from scratches.
Okay.
So, and then we don't get any money from Gates. Pearson donates my time to the project as part of their. Let's see what happens. So it's not cheap. But $3 million over 3 years, $1 million a year, 4 games.
$1 million here, $1 million there. Adds up. I saw in your Argubots, I didn't see the significance of counter and pro facts or the weights associated. So, for example, arsenic, it manages your level of vitamin D. That's pro for drinking it. It kills you. That's con. So that's equal.
Right. No, they're actually when you get into the advanced. So we start out very simple with chocolate or vanilla ice cream. Critics like it, kids hate it, whatever. But then we do get into at the most advanced. You have multiple arguments and multiple weights that you're.
Okay.
That you are
So
building
are
in.
there associated virtual physical artifacts with the robots? Like if you perform the best argument, it's like equivalent of getting a weapon that.
So they don't build out, but if you win, if you beat the other argument, the Argubot kind of like goes like this. Yes. We don't say it's killed because we don't know what it's called. But but it goes to sleep. But we don't have. What you do is as you go around, you're collecting evidence for your arguments. And so it becomes, and different evidence, then different arguments fight different kinds of evidence. And so it's almost like a Pokemon kind of, what is the argument that will
Magic together.
use this, right?
Just want to see that with lawyers fist fighting that scene.
There are. I just recently saw a courtroom game that was an argumentation game. Like
That's
based
awesome.
in a
Yeah.
courtroom. I don't know if they were actually.
Sorry, I wasn't here earlier, but I want to see, you probably mentioned it, but how do you measure the impact? Is there a type of design, evidence design that measures the impact?
So the question of impact is interesting. So one question of impact is how much do people learn? And so in-game, we can say, well, when we see kids starting off playing, they were here at level 1, and now we see them playing, and they're building these really sophisticated arguments, and they seem to be up higher over here. So we can gather in-game evidence. So that's one way of, we use the assessment itself as evidence of the impact. Then the next step is, and what, if you're going to get funding from someone like Gates, they want to see more than in-game. So what we design basically validity studies where we have other outside measures of gameplay, and we have a pre-post control group design where you start off, everyone takes a pre-test, half of them play the game, half of them do something else, like read a book about argumentation, and everybody gets a post-test, and you see, okay, do the kids who play the game do better on your post-test than the kids who read the book? So that's kind of like the gold standard of that, the big funding agencies are looking for in terms of which are or randomized control group RCTs, randomized control trials. Those are very expensive just to do them. So that usually those kind of grants will have evaluation money attached to them, where a portion of the money that you're getting is actually for that evaluation work.
What's that?
The million.
The
Yeah,
million.
go on.
Have you ever seen school? When I was a math teacher, I got the job to experiment on children. Wow. But to what extent have you found schools willing to try different stuff? Because the idea of doing that is simple, easy, and very cheap if the school said yes.
So I will say there's two things. On one hand, it can be almost impossible to get into schools. Like, they have all of these restrictions and processes and things. On the other hand, you know the superintendent, and the superintendent says, I want to do this. So, actually, just a couple weeks ago, I went down in Tucson, and there was a meeting of this group called the League of Innovative Schools. Right? It sounds like she'd be wearing superhero capes. But it's like 30 schools around the country that have where all their superintendents were down meeting, and they are very interested. And so they were down in Sunnyside, which is an implementer of the games at ASU. So Sunnyside was hosting this group of about 30 superintendents, and they all are interested in this kind of thing. Would all be interested in trying things out and running these kind of experimentation.
Charter schools are another source. Sometimes they're interested.
Yeah.
It is all about relationships with, companies or whoever you have.
So yeah, it's
not easy, but
not easy to get in.
If you get a job there, then it's easy.
Yes.
As long as no one's observing you,
Right.
and you don't
You can
tell
try
anyone.
whatever you want.
Yeah. You can do lots of stuff.
So things like structuring the game to go with the curriculum, stuff like that, have that been a problem? Is that kind of what your wall is, basically?
Yeah, so it's getting the right amount of gameplay, because the other thing is you can create a game that takes 2 months to play, it's really deep and involved, but the school has 1 week to cover that content, and they're going to be in and out. So matching the gameplay to their scope and sequence is definitely a big challenge. And if you're thinking, I want a game that gets at lots of different skills. It gets at social studies skills, and some history, and it gets at some biology. But it turns out that they cover that biology topic in November, and they cover that history topic in May. Now it's all out of sequence, and the teacher doesn't quite know how to integrate it and what's going on.
And it sounds like they want you to be able to further the assessment, to turn around and do it in the classroom right after you play the game, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so that limits the more time that you have to cram the game into.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
harsh.
Exactly. It's not easy. But when I was at Cisco, the nice thing with the Cisco curriculum was we were literally we made the domain, right? Cisco was making up networking. Not like in science where there's all these competing theories. So we made the domain, and we made the curriculum, and we made the assessments, and we made the certification exams. So it was great. But even then, what we found when we just had the simulation and the games standalone by themselves, we had about 25% of teachers. We would have teachers. We could get great quotes, right? The teacher, this is the best thing since ever, and awesome. But we never really could break that 25% of the teachers using it. We then created the curriculum where literally it was right here now. Open the simulation up. Do these 2 things. Play these 2 levels. Now, here we go. And it was completely embedded. We were up to 85% adoption because it was just seamless. And so that's what I'm trying to get to, but we're here and that vision is there. But the challenge was now to do it outside of that world of computer networking. See if we can extend it.
Well, what about the partner, the Institute of Play? They have those schools.
Yeah.
So how have they been integrating some of the things you've been doing there?
So they have, and so the schools in New York and Chicago, they're Quest to Learn is the names of them. They're basically charter schools. And they have literally game designers on staff that are working with the teachers and doing these short cycles of games. And they do physical games, they do digital games, they do all kinds of board games, all kinds of things. So they're definitely implementing the things and trying them out. But they're kind of small scale too, and really not representative of a regular school. There's, a very different vision of what school can be, and it's really exciting and cool, but probably doesn't generalize to the rest of all the schools in the
What are
country.
they called? What is that school?
Quest to Learn.
Is that Dragon Box?
Mm-hmm.
Dragon Box is I got
I-
a lot of.
Emailed the creator of that, and he responded, so he's very
Oh,
responsive.
wow.
But is there any studies on? Because that seemed really hyper focused.
Right.
Yeah, unfortunately, one randomized control trial
no.
just came out, and it wasn't so positive.
Basically, why would that? I mean, what was the
There just
reason
wasn't
for
much
that?
difference between the outcomes for kids that were playing that and the
Hmm.
outcomes for kids that were doing more traditional instruction.
You don't actually draw the
That's more
equations in it. You just grab them as modules and drop them in.
Yeah.
Well, right. So you start off with dragons. And,
Right.
One dragon.
Similar
There's
to
no
the-
numbers. Yeah,
Right.
it's just to make the dragons on both sides equal. So it's bringing that idea of algebra. So yeah, the question to me isn't, and the thing that I could talk forever about RCTs, but I think there's lots of. They're not really the be all and end all. They are one way of assessing what's working. But if you say, okay, you're going to read a book for an hour, play a game for an hour, that's one comparison. But part of the piece of games is that they're so engaging that students want to play more time than the hour, and they want to do it at home and so it increases the amount of practice they have. So that's usually not the comparison that is happening in a randomized control trial. They're usually saying the same dosage because it's from that medical model of each, and how does the outcomes compare.
So you might play Dragon Box randomly when you're standing in line in the car or whatever, and you might be wanting to play it, right? Say, I gotta get back to it, and then as far as class, you might be like, God, I gotta go again. You must sit there and slog through the time that you're there, and then you leave.
The system doesn't adapt to the student or the individual.
Right, exactly. This allows them that freedom, which is, I think, really interesting. Because, I mean, I always say every game is a learning opportunity. I mean, it's a learning tool, no matter what, because in order for you to beat that game, you have to learn how to play that game. And that's why I think, you can take SimCities or you can take Minecraft and you can build things around them. It's just about how you create that narrative, and I think that's what's interesting, and how you associate that beyond that game. That's why the teacher comes in, right? So, again, it could be the role of the parent or somebody at least to help with the student or the child or whoever is playing this game to kind of associate that into the real world and use that knowledge.
That's how common we find that. Like there's the chess guy who wrote a book, How Chess is Like Life. And I found a lot of great insight from a variety of games. But I don't see it's very common that people abstract their in-game, or even in their training, like an engineer, system success to other aspects of their life.
Or if you do, you get a little bit ridiculed, right?
Why don't you just think like me rather than...
I'm a guild leader in World of Warcraft. That's on my resume. You go, that's stupid. And you're like, well, I'm managing all these guys every night for 6 hours a week. Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thank you very much. Anybody else have any last questions? And there's probably some time just to kind of talk to. Yeah, exactly. Have some more drinks and food and stuff. But you want to talk about the Education Hackathon?
Plug the hackathon again. If anybody's interested, I don't know if anyone is interested. Cher has a little bit. I'm going to let Cher talk. Cher's my right hand.
Pass the ball.
So if you are interested, I think we have a flyer somewhere, or maybe the link was on the meetup, but we have a hackathon.io site where you can go and read all the rules, but I'll just summarize them essentially. It should be a game with some sort of education focus that can both teach and assess, and if you have to choose between the two, we're looking for games that assess, and we're looking to evaluate based on how engaging it is, based on how successful it is at assessing something, and based on the use of game mechanics to achieve that assessment and engagement. So it shouldn't just be the SATs on a computer screen, for example, or on a board game. And aside from that, it's really, really open. So when you think about the learner or the student, don't think about kindergartners necessarily. Think about nursing students. Think about people who need to use rhetoric. So it can be really any skill. However, to equip you, we are going to open up a set of Pearson APIs. Do any of you have worked with APIs before?
I've done it before. I haven't done it in a long time.
So they're a bit like databases. They're like services with lots of content in them, and you can query them. So we have an API that's DK images. It's like 20,000, 25,000.
DK is the books. You've probably seen it with lots of illustrations, like dictionary type books, and I can't think of all the Dorling Kindersley books. If you've ever gone to school in America or the UK, you've seen those books. So it's all of those images, correct?
Yeah, it's all of those images, and you can send in a query for cat, and you don't just get to type it into an interface like that. There's more code that goes around it, but then you get returned a whole bunch of different images of cats that are from this enormous database. So in it, let me just pull up to give you an idea, and come talk to me if you're curious, or go look up the information on our website. But we have dictionaries. There's a whole bunch of content for the Financial Times about finance and the stock market. There's actual pedagogical APIs. So there's Brilliant Business Book Series. So it has a whole bunch of different chapters and paragraphs and modules on like business basics and finance skills. So you definitely don't have to use that, but if you are looking to let Pearson do some of the legwork, just like you can let your own work as a game developer do some of the legwork, let us help you. And so all that information will be up on there.
Yeah, we don't have the API stuff yet on there, right?
It's not up on there yet, but it will be there as soon as I get home.
Yeah, that's cool. That's very cool. Yeah, we've got 7 people signed up already and 2 projects. Reiterate.
Awesome.
And Tane, I know you've got students who want to do educational games.
Yeah.
Because they've emailed me and stuff. So see if they can do something for that. I know it's a tall order, 3 weeks, make a game with assessment and learning.
Yeah, very open-ended.
Yeah.
Obviously, it doesn't need to assess,
It doesn't need to be.
It doesn't
breadth
need to be
of
super
the skills.
Yeah.
It could assess 2 things or 1 thing. You've got the very beginnings of it. I was with
the
your
festival.
biology. You've got the start there, so yeah.
Does it have to be like academically educational?
So you choose. It can be any kind of skill or knowledge or behavior that you want to assess. So it could be like I imagine the potential for there to be like a behavioral health assessment that's a game. So it doesn't necessarily have to be. Do you know this particular kind of knowledge that's specific to school?
So it could be something abstract like survivalism, like QM on the rule of 3, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool.
There's actually
Let's
there's a cookbook API, or there's like a couple kitchen-based APIs. So if you want to make like do you know what salt is usually paired with, you can probably figure out how to hack the system to do that.